about what you hear in these sorts of exercises so that we can make sure that how we're responding to the information is in line with what your thoughts are. So I think you'll see a lot of familiar horticulture innovation faces. So we are going to have a subject matter expert, Pat Fry, talk to us today, and I'll be introducing Pat. He is who's a partner of growth strategy at Kantar. Kantar is a leading Australian strategy house with brand and consumer expertise both here in Australia and overseas. And Pat's going to talk you through the methodology and the results of the study, and he's going to help you understand how to read the 2,000 plus pages of this report, but also bring the insights for your particular industry. When we're talking or when Pat's presenting and sharing his slides, it's probably going to be easier if we all have our cameras off, but turn them on for when we get back to communications and conversations. If you don't hear anything, if you've got any problems, please put it in the chat so that Jade and I can fix that for you. And I'm going to ask everyone to stay on mute for the moment so that we can let Pat do his talking. I will just remind everyone that we are recording this session. And at the end of the session, we do have a short survey because we want to make sure we really welcome your feedback to make sure that we continue to improve on these. I'll stop now and hand over to you, Pat.
Thanks, Mila. I'll share my screen. If you could let me know when you can see it, that would be great.
I can see it, Pat, and I can see it in the presenter mode now. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so look, I'm going to cover just a bit of an introduction, but I know that many of you have seen this, so I won't dwell on it, but I will canter through it, but please stop me if you have a question, because some of the background is very important, and hopefully it'll cover some of the questions that you may have. So the bit of background and objectives, the market prioritisation section, so I'll spend a bit of time on that because that's really important to understand why the markets that we choose as priorities have landed where they've landed, and we've used very objective metrics to make sure that that's robust. So I'll go through and explain that in some detail, and then we'll focus on the apple and pear sections, and there's lots of other detail that is you have access to separately. So let me get straight into it. So in terms of background, as you may know, this was addressing the disruptions from COVID and our ability to export. So Hort Innovation proactively initiated and invested in several critical projects. Deloitte did a report initially which identified 13 markets, and really this report is really was about developing and building on that work. So we took those markets, and now this is much more of an in-depth view of what's going on, and it was around consumption. So we focused on consumers because the challenge we were given is we really don't understand consumers in these markets. So let's come to understand them more, and that can help us drive exports profitably in these geographies. I won't dwell on the Deloitte report. You've got access to it. I will say that there were 12 markets originally that were identified. India was added later. It actually ended up 17th on the list in the order when they did their work, but that was put in quite presciently because it turns out that India is quite an attractive market for many commodities. So that was why it was added in later, and so we've got India in our work. So the central question was, how can Australian horticultural industries unlock growth by generating consumer demand for different categories across different international markets for today and tomorrow? I should also say the word profitability is also a key driver here, so I'll get to that in a moment, but we're really looking at profitable growth throughout all these markets. So the objectives were consumer-led. I mentioned we focused on attitudes and values of consumers. We looked at shopping behaviour, fresh produce, fruits, vegetables and nuts were covered across the 13 markets, and it was really to provide a strategic lens, and you'll see it's all around attractiveness and addressability of commodities across markets. So the overall goal was this is about optimising export and product positioning today, and more importantly into the future. So what would we do if we're looking at taking that future lens? And so this is to help really facilitate deployment of effective resources for trade marketing and where we might export in the future. Four-step approach. I won't go into detail, but we're in number 4, which is about alignment and embedding. So we did some auditing up front, and localisation was a expert interview program, a large quant study with a 4,000 sample of consumers per market, less for some of the more difficult markets like Qatar, and we did 8,000 occasions, so very, very large sample, which is really what we do when we do these big studies to give us a robust objective outcome, and that's what we were challenged to do. Just a view of the markets, USA, UK, Singapore, India, Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea. Malaysia, UAE, Qatar, Taiwan, Vietnam and Indonesia. China was purposely excluded because it was all about looking for opportunities beyond China. And there are all the commodities, and in particular fruit, and today we'll cover apples and pears, obviously. There's 3 category reports, by the way, so when you dig into the detail, you can get everything you need in one of these 3. The idea being that you would start here to focus on, or it tells you where we think you should go, or where the data is telling us we should go. And then each market has their own category reports. So if you choose that for your industry, a certain market is a focus, there's a report specific to that market, which goes into a lot more detail. So market prioritization, a key part of this study. And this was to determine from a consumer perspective which markets represent the strongest growth opportunities for Australian exports. And this was based on usage, appeal, and the ability to command a premium. It's also worth noting that we've used some other metrics like supply chain, regulatory environment, much of the work that came from Deloitte, because what we didn't want to do was just focus on consumer. There are other market factors that we needed to bring in. So we wanted to make this a holistic study so that you didn't need to go back to old reports. It was the sort of the last port of call. So we've baked in as much data from previous work as we can, and you'll see, I'll explain a little bit more about that detail in a minute. But fundamentally, the evaluation was on 2 axes, attractiveness, and that's how attractive is the consumer opportunity in a market for a commodity. That's the predominant lens, but there's also other things in there too. And then the next one is addressability, and this is how addressable is a consumer opportunity in a market for a commodity. So really, how hard or easy is it to go after? And these formed, well, the metrics that went into calculating these were 3 for attractiveness. One is penetration. Next, it was about paying a premium, and then finally market access. And they were weighted. The first one was 30%. The next one was actually 40%. It's not in there, but it was. And then the final one was 30%. So they added up to 100%. We came up with these weightings with the input of the PRG and Hort Innovation. So there was lots of support we had from those 2 groups, which made this study much more possible. So thank you to those people who were involved. So just a bit about the question here. So penetration was how often you consume each commodity. So that just gives us a view of the indicative size. The bigger, the better, obviously. Likelihood to pay a premium. So would you be willing to pay more for a premium quality commodity? And this tells you effectively the more attractive is it, the higher you are, or the more likely you are to pay premium, the more likely the commodity would be to get a premium price. So obviously more attractive when that's higher. And then the Deloitte market access metrics. So there's a whole page on this which shows you some of the data that we used. So in that single metric, it breaks down like this, and we've used import dependency. So things like 3-year average value of imports, consumption share of production, 10-year change of the value. And what this represents is that higher values are indicators that demonstrate greater reliance on imports and sustained growth. So that's useful. Secondly, future economic prospects. So we used level change in GDP per capita. So that's between 20 and 2030. So a future view. Level change in urban population. So high values demonstrate larger or high income markets. So that's useful. And finally, preference advantage. So things like the WEF, quality of demand. Do horticulture imports align with ours? And is the country in the Northern Hemisphere? So that seasonality factor. So higher rankings there demonstrate greater potential for Australian horticulture to differentiate itself in that market. So that's how that was formulated. Then the second dimension was addressability. And the metrics here were likely to purchase Australian, 30% weighting, ability to command a premium, 40%, and market access, and I'll go into that in a minute. So likelihood to purchase premium, the question there was which would you be most likely to buy imported from Australia? And so this just gives the a view on what's brand Australia like for a certain commodity in a market. The second one was how willing would you be to pay more premium for a premium quality commodity? So this is a more general thing. And so this is about the commodities for which there is an untapped premium opportunity. So also, the higher the command of premium, the more addressable it is. And then finally, market access, which is 30% of that calculation. And this was made up of 2 dimensions. The first being the ease of trade and market risk. So things like the WEF foreign competition. existence of free trade agreements or whether we're in negotiation, political stability, and the WTO dispute status. So higher scores indicate lower cost of doing business and reduced risk of market disruption from political factors. The second dimension there is the value chain competitiveness. So distance to market was a big one. So the further away they are, the harder they are to address. Port Transport Infrastructure Index from WEF, and Australian horticultural import prices relative to country average. So high rankings demonstrate greater potential for Australian horticulture to differentiate itself. So also useful in that should say market access addressability actually. So we bring these two together in a matrix, and it will look like this in a moment, and I'll show you, and I know some of you have seen this, but just a brief explanation. So not surprisingly, when things are highly attractive and highly addressable, they end up in the top right, and that's really been the focus of this report. And that means that there's strong overall consumer export opportunity given where that is. On the right of this chart, where things are more addressable, but certain markets may not be as attractive, we call them low-hanging fruit, and that's where they're still worth going after because they're easy to go after. It just means that you're likely not to get the same bang for buck or return on investment as some of the strategic priority markets. So that's how to read that. And on the left-hand side of the quadrant, things are where they're less addressable. Where things are less addressable but highly attractive, this is what we call a long-term play. And that might mean that more investment is needed. It might take longer to get into that market and achieve that growth. But in the longer run, they're quite attractive, so worth thinking about in the long term. But if things are not very addressable or attractive, then they are really low priority. The thing I want to say about here is that it doesn't mean that you can't go after any of these markets. So it's really important to understand. This is about prioritization. And that means that on balance, things that are more towards the top right of this quadrant, the investment, the time, and what you'll get in return, you'll get a bigger bang for your buck. Well, that's what the data is showing us. Where things down the bottom left, low priority, it doesn't mean that you can't trade there, and certainly there are markets where you may trade there already. This just means that if things are down there, it might be worth considering where you spend your resources in future and maybe channeling them away from those markets. But these are all relative terms. That's the other thing. So please bear that in mind. And before I show you, again, we developed these four considerations off the back of speaking to other industries. And there are four key things that are really important to understand, and this hopefully may address some of your questions that you might have. The first one is about no existing technical market access. Second is markets with existing trade. Third is premium opportunity, and the fourth is focus of investment, and I'll explain them in detail. So the first one is where existing technical market access for a commodity, it was intentionally not included in the valuation of addressability. This was a question that came up. And the reason for that was this project was designed to identify attractive and addressable future growth geographies, and therefore the analysis was not restricted to current. So we didn't want to be tied into today. So we wanted this to very much be about where should we go in future. And so that this research was intended to support and inform industry decisions regarding the progress of any future or ongoing market access or market improvement requests. So that's the first thing to understand. The second one is, while the addressability calculation includes data on general market access and trade, it intentionally does not include whether Australia currently trades in a particular commodity. And the reason for this is that the goal of the analysis was to provide an objective assessment of whether a market is attractive and addressable, independent of current arrangements. So, if a market that we are currently trading in for a particular commodity is shown not to be a strategic priority, this does not mean that we should consider withdrawing from it. And further to what I was just saying before is that, however, we would recommend re-evaluating the relative focus of investment in this market and consider other markets when looking for future growth opportunities. And I know that Japan was something that came up in here where many commodities are already trading with Japan, but it doesn't end up as a high priority and in some cases a low priority. So if that comes up, that explains part of why. The third one is the premium opportunity. And this was in evaluating attractiveness and addressability, we've intentionally used data that shows where premium opportunity can be found. And the reason for this is that the objective of the project was to identify profitable growth opportunities for commodities in the future. And so Australian commodities will have more chance of growing profitably, where they have a better chance of commanding a price premium. So this is not about markets where we can dump volume, it's about where we might deploy resources or export where there's a better chance of commanding a premium. So high commodity penetration in the market has also been used to evaluate attractiveness, but we favour markets where there's a larger opportunity for Australian products to command a premium. So another important consideration. And then finally, focus of the investment. So the evaluation of prioritisation in markets of attractiveness and addressability is intended to be only one input into decision making about where to focus investment. Now, there's obviously factors and other data sources that you may have access to, particularly related to your particular circumstances. So the objective of this project was to primarily offer a consumer lens into commodity consumption that enabled export decisions to be informed by robust consumer data. And I talked about that large data set. And we still included additional market factors like Deloitte analysis. But when decisions are made about a certain market, with export decisions, we would encourage other available information to be used. So this would include the economics of local growers and exporters, but this report forms one input into that decision process. We hope that it is very useful and it informs a key part of any decision, but if you have other data sources or if there's any intelligence that may not have made it in here, please use it. We would encourage it, but hopefully this does a good job of getting you quite a long way there. So I might just pause there before I show you the output to see if there's any questions that I might answer before we cut to the actual outputs.
If there are any questions, if people could turn their cameras on, take themselves off mute, use the hands up if you can, or turn your camera on and wave at me. And if there aren't any questions just yet, we'll get Pat to continue.
Let's carry on.
Let's carry on.
Okay, right. So without further ado, here are the results. So what we found and what the data is telling us is that the strategic priorities for apples are Malaysia, UAE, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And we'll go through, we'll show you some of the detail on why that's the case. And I am aware that many of you have read this and have access to it, so you do have all the data at your disposal. Maybe you have specific questions, which I'm happy to take. But you've seen the inputs that drew us to that conclusion. Singapore's low-hanging fruit, so once again, a good opportunity, but compared to some of those other markets, certainly this data suggests that it wasn't attractive as some of the other Southeast Asian markets that we saw. You can see on the top left, India is quite attractive actually. It's the second most attractive, but just harder to address for various reasons. And once again, the data is there to show that. Hong Kong, Taiwan, USA, also long-term play. Now, USA is an interesting one because that's the least addressable, and the reason for that, if I recall, is there's tariffs and also the local market. Local competition is very high, and also competition from other geographies that are much closer to the USA. Distance, obviously, key thing. And with the UK as well, you can see in the bottom, UK distance is a big deal. Local competition, not very attractive because UK consumers don't really think that they can get any good quality fruit and vegetables for a good price, so price is not a thing. And there you go, Japan is down the bottom there. So yeah, that all sorts of reasons why that didn't come up. But the main thing there for Japan was Australia doesn't command that premiumness as it does in some of those other markets. So what the data is telling us is that those olive green markets up there are the ones that we're suggesting, or this data would suggest that would be the best strategic priority, where we'd get a much bigger return on investment, or certainly for the near future, that's where we should be going. So I might pause there because this is a key slide, and the rest of the data will flow. But just wanted to get any views from the audience now regarding those outputs and whether there's anything there that surprised them or not. Otherwise, once again, Mila will carry on unless there's any comments right now. This tends to be the moment where people have an opinion, so I like to. Jenny, yes. I can't hear you, Jenny.
You hear me now?
Are you on? Yes, you're off mute now. Great.
Very surprising. I have an opinion. I think this graph is really interesting. What encourages me is that a lot of the markets leading to the top right quadrant are markets we're already focused on, and when there's a body of work to achieve access where that doesn't exist. I know that's not the purpose of your study, but it means the work we're doing is heading in the right direction. What I find interesting is where Japan sits here. And if you don't mind, can you elaborate a little bit on how you determine that Japan doesn't necessarily have a premium space? Is it for produce in general is your view, or in the apple category specifically? And I guess then the follow-up part of that question is, how far did this particular study go into understanding the place for brand? Because apples is a bit unique in that brand is really prevalent, because that's where we actually see the opportunity.
So look, John, was there another comment there, or should I take those two questions? I'll take those questions. Give me a second while I just share with you some data behind the scenes, because this will be useful. I'll just unhide these slides. I had them hidden because I was curious whether there'd be a question, but now there is one. I will share them. So this is the detail. So look, first of all, well, this is a very, very interesting chart straight away, in that if you look at how often people consume apples, Japan was the lowest by a long shot. So that's an interesting first metric. And this is obviously plays a big part in the calculation. So first of all, if you look at the top end, much more highly penetrated compared to Japan. The second metric is willingness to pay. And once again, Japan is right down the bottom. So we saw this across lots of commodities, Jenny. It wasn't just here. That that like the UK, and yes, indeed here the UK as well. UK and Japanese consumers, we understand from also local experts, is that they're so used to having whatever they want whenever they want, that there's a feeling that they don't have to pay a premium for good quality stuff. And that's a thing that's true for these markets. So that's why those two markets are down there. And then when we rank them, actually in market access, it's much higher, but Japan is quite high up there. So, and that would explain many of these commodities you're already doing business, so market access is good. It's just that on the penetration and premiumness really falls short compared to other markets that we saw. And that was really across a lot of commodities too. So then the second dimension here was how likely would you to buy an apple imported from Australia, and really, really low. In fact, once again, the lowest. Korea, UK also. And then how willing would you be to pay more for premium quality apples specifically? Japan quite good here, but it didn't outweigh those other factors actually. So because if you look at the premium chart, because the buying imported from Australia is so low, it doesn't get compensated by this willingness to pay for premium apple. So what this suggests is that there's a small population of people who would like an Australian apple and would pay a premium, but really not enough to warrant celebrating, and that's why it ends up very low there. Market access addressability also very low, which is not surprising. So you can kind of see it's that consumption, that openness to Australia, the willingness to pay a premium are the really big factors that bring that down. So that's where we got to. In terms of brand, we did have some questions around the different varietals. So Pink Lady and other things that were in there, but they were quite overwhelmed by the other metrics. So because of the piping of the survey was such that we had to really ask people, had you had an apple? And you can see that at 28%, even if brand did have a contributing factor, it wasn't enough to raise it to a level where it started to look attractive and addressable, Jenny. So whilst there might be opportunities for branded products, the data would still suggest that if you were to going after other markets would probably get you more for your investment in the future. That's certainly where we landed and where we concluded. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Mila, would you indulge me? Can I tease that out a little bit more, please?
Mm-hmm.
Jump in. And again, sorry, before Jenny gets going, if there are questions, particularly on this topic, put your hand up. We'll get to you because Jenny's got some great ideas and insights, but I bet others do too. Thank you, Jenny.
So with the likeliness of buying an Australian apple specifically, I mean, that's sitting very, very low, but I imagine surely the lack of any interesting alternatives that come from Australia or distinctively known from Australia really impacts that number. So at the moment in the Japanese consumer's mind, there's nothing interesting about an Australian apple that's differentiated from Japanese grown apples, in fact. And this is where the brand piece plays in. What we do best in our positioning for most of our apple exports are around a handful of very specific brand pieces. And in some cases, you can only get that from Australia, and it's not currently available in Japan at all. So I guess it's rather than apples for apples, we're actually almost talking like a new product to market because they haven't seen, for example, they don't get much Pink Lady in there as an example. To my knowledge, I don't think they have Bravo or Saluna in there. Anyone on the line, feel free to correct me. So I just wonder if we've kind of conflated the lack of provenance marking on apples, which wouldn't be there because they're all going to be open commodity varieties, with the opportunity for something that would be perceived as a new apple in Japan, which is an apple consuming kind of place.
Look, all that's very, very valid, Jenny, and I think there's merit in considering different alternatives and trying to open up Japan. But looking at this chart, stepping back from a strategic lens, I just think the data is quite overwhelming here that Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, far more open to your product. You've got an open door there. So I guess what the data is showing here is that certainly in the near term, you've got an opportunity with these markets that are very open to Australian produce. Whereas I look at this chart and I think, dabbling with some ideas in Japan, it may get you somewhere. But if I was advising you to use your investment elsewhere, I'd be saying look towards the left of the chart, because you can see that you've got consumers who are overwhelmingly more likely to want to buy Australian than Korea, Japan, UK, for example. So that's really what this data is trying to show us, which is, we use the same survey across all these countries, and the likelihood to buy Australian apples at the top end is much more. The brand Australia really is seen as a good thing there. Japan, brand Australia in Japan for many commodities just didn't seem to be there, Jenny, and we saw that time again. So look, I think all your questions are valid and the ideas are good, but I think the decision is for you to determine where the weight of your investment needs to go in the future, because it might be that other markets you're likely to get more return on your investment, and it would be much easier for you. And that's what addressability is all about. How hard is this? And honestly, Japan feels like it's hard. Compared to some of the other markets. So, but once again, what we're saying is this is not a definitive thing to say don't go after it, and you might have some good ideas there. But I would suggest that looking at other markets for future opportunities is also worthwhile, given this data.
Completely agree. So in terms of industry's activities, that front half of that graph is where all of our activity actually is at the moment. I guess just wanted to pull out why the Japan thing, because we had been under the impression that should we go in with a premium product that is different to the classic Granny Fuji that they currently have available in Japan, that we would actually find ourselves in a different spot. And I think this means that we need to tease that out even further, because your read is that it's in fact very low.
Well, that's what this data is showing us. So, there might be other research that delved directly into that. And this was a large sample survey as well. So, it wasn't small. So, yeah, it's quite a robust. So I'd encourage you to use this data and really give some thought to your activity in Japan. And if there's other data that nudges it in a bit different direction, that's okay. But it's promising to hear that you've got investment directed in those markets where this data is suggesting, you've got an open door far more than other markets.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Pat. Are there other questions at this stage? Yes, I can hear. I see your hand up, Sean. Would you like to turn your camera and microphone on?
Yeah, hello everyone, and Pat, thank you for sharing that that insight, and Jenny for your question. I just back on the Japan one. Obviously for us, that is quite a focus, and knowing what we know about the Japan market. But you mentioned that brand Australia on other commodities didn't seem to have such a strong appeal as in some other geographies. Would that relate to like citrus and so forth, that it didn't have such a high ranking. Because in Japan, there's very little, I'm not aware of, we don't have protocol from mainland to go to Japan. So a consumer in Japan likely doesn't know a lot about Australian apples anyway. But if you say that brand Australia didn't rank that high compared to other territories, it'd be interesting just to elaborate a bit on that.
Okay, maybe I should be clear about that, and maybe Brand Australia is probably not the way to say, because this was not about, we didn't ask about Brand Australia specifically. It was, we asked the question as it was asked, Sean. So what this gives us an indication of is, in consumers' minds, how much of a kind of halo does Australia have, which is slightly different. But you can see that this chart shows that in those countries at the top left, which all the top 4 actually ended up being in that strategic priority. When you talk about Australia, you know, their eyes light up and they smile, and they Australia is seen as clean and green and all that good stuff. So when it comes to an apple, they go, yeah, I'd buy an apple from Australia. And that's how a respondent would interpret it. Does that make sense? So I think that's the way to read this, as literally as that. Because we've asked people, you know, do you buy an apples and how likely would you buy Australia? Oh, yeah, 36% of Vietnamese said they'd buy an Australian apple. So I think, I don't know the answer to your citrus question, by the way, but we can look it up for sure. And it is available, actually, so you can find it. But just I know, broadly speaking, Japanese consumers didn't have that sort of halo of Australia across lots of commodities. And it did end up surprisingly, actually. And Japan is the one we've spoken most about with industries, not just here. So yeah, we've spoken a lot about Japan, and it is just it's hard because I know that there's a lot of trade there, but the future is looking in other markets. And it's not to say there isn't opportunity in Japan, but for some commodities it was a volume play. For some of them they've been there a long time. And there might be opportunities to leverage some further, more specific branded opportunities. But this study was more broadly across the 13 markets, and it does show when you step back a minute from Japan, there's some other really good opportunities that are worth following, is what the data is telling us.
Sure, okay. Thanks for that, Pat.
Pat, there is a question in the chat around citrus and table grapes and how did they score. We actually have those figures. Jenny will dig those out and make sure that you have them. If we have time in the presentation today, we'll come back to them. There's also a, oh, sorry, Olivia's already answered that. For citrus in Japan, the appeal was 7%, ranked second last after Korea. Thanks. Look, we do have all of those. The figures that Pat has shared with you are in the full report. So we'll find them and put them in front of you, everybody. While we're going to let Pat move on to the next section now, unless there's further questions. Back to you, Pat.
Good. I'm conscious of time because there's still quite a lot of content, and just so you know, and you probably guessed, the next section we profiled the top priority commodities, also in markets, because when we did it originally, it was just too much to get your head around, and for the most part, the industries and the PAG gave us this guidance in that you focus on the key ones. All of the data on all the markets is available. As I've just showed you some of it, and there's appendices that cover everything. So if you can't find it, I'd be surprised. But we can certainly help you look, to Miller's point. So what I'll do in this next section is we'll look at the 4 markets that ended up as priorities here. Just to start to give you a flavour of what to do, and this starts to get into the how to win more for that. So first of all, and we just looked at this, you can see that the penetration for all of these markets is very high. So 67% in Malaysia, down to 50% in Vietnam, but all very, very high. Snacking and dinner was a big one for this, but there's also lunch, breakfast, so different day parts for different markets. So we found this interesting across all commodities, that really you do have to look at each market individually. So we tried to have these snapshot slides at the very high level where we could see commonalities, and there are indeed commonalities. But when it came to picking a market, so for example, if you decide to go after Malaysia, there really is differences for other markets, so you do have to look at each one in turn. But for here, if you look at the next one, for example, the how, fresh on its own, not surprisingly, came up very highly for apples, and as part of a snack, part of a meal also in Indonesia and UAE. The why, quick and easy and tasty, not surprising. There's also a lot in more of the detail around the premium opportunity, so I'll cover that in a minute. But quick and easy and taste was a big one. Health and nutrition, physical, mental energy, slightly different for Indo and UAE. At home, it's that grab an apple around the house, and mostly by yourselves with family was the key one there. And then the next stage is around the strategic imperatives, around the preferences, the needs we need to satisfy, functional attributes, and there's now the premium opportunity. So I won't go through every single thing here, but if you look at Malaysia, the consumer preference is a tasty, quick and easy snack or dinner, fresh on its own, at home with friends or by themselves. So it's just a really one page. The other thing I should say about these snapshot slides is that we tried to cater to all audiences. So you'll see there's some non-data slides, there's some semi-data slides with some insights, and there's some heavy data slides with some insights. So there are 3 levels of types of displays here, and we came to that conclusion with Hort Innovation and PRG that was a good way of catering to all people. We try to do all things to all people, and this is certainly one of those no data slides that some people might prefer. I think the interesting one is the premium opportunity here. Fresher, free of pesticides. So that organic came through quite strongly. Appetizing, and I trust its safety. So safety is a big thing in UAE, particularly for apples. Overcoming expense in Malaysia was one, and also more exciting alternatives. So the competitors started to come up, and those were bananas and mangoes. Bruising easily, expense again in Vietnam, and not filling enough, expires quickly UAE. So you can see that the barriers to overcome were also different in different markets. Bananas, mangoes, pretty much the key substitutes, but table grapes also creeping in there. Okay, so the other thing I will go into here is, and I won't go through everything in detail, but I'll try and call out the key things. But what I will say is that if you look at these charts, there's an average for apples, and that's the average for the ones on this page, but also the Australian data. So some of you may be aware that we did a piece of work in Australia before the international piece. So what we've tried to do is drag out that information where possible, so where the questions were comparable, and here it certainly is. And what's interesting here is that in Australia, as a snack, 61%, so very, very large, 2/3 almost, but that's very different across these markets. So just that in and of itself is quite insightful in terms of thinking about going after these other markets. We just have to think, well, consumers certainly think very differently about when they consume apples, and you can see the differences there. What kind of snack? Fairly similar when you break out the snacking piece. But for Malaysia there, a snack between lunch and dinner is most of that. So once again, hopefully this is useful data if you choose to go after some of these markets to help work out what type of, the way you go to market and what types of products they're needing. All the whats and the W's help contribute to that type of decision. How it was consumed, once again in Australia, fresh on its own was the largest. But when you start to look at Indonesia and UAE, very different across the piece. Fresh on its own is obviously still big, but you get things like in smoothies and frappes, in salads, fresh as part of a meal as well. So those apple salads coming through in some of those other markets. Where were you? At home was a big one, but at UAE, out of home, a lot more people. So once again, there's some interesting differences across markets that these charts hopefully explained. Once again, these are sort of those middle type charts that just gave some information, some high level data and some insights to help navigate. All the ends are down below, so you can see how most of those questions are pretty robust sample. Qatar was just a smaller sample because it's harder to get people there, much smaller country. So, but all the other markets are pretty high, pretty robust. Where did you get them from? some of these are pretty straightforward, so I won't dwell on them, but we included them in the reporting just so that you've got everything. So you can use them if you will, but these might be things that you already know, but they're certainly in here. Who were you with? Yeah, that's quite a difference there. In Australia, just myself, most people, but lots more sharing going on, or sharing opportunities. And I think that reflects the bigger family dynamics in Australia, in countries in like Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, UAE, where there's multi-generational families and more sharing meals, etc., relative to Australia, really. So that kind of comes through in this type of chart. Then the why was the next big thing. So we did some work off the back of the work in Australia where we did a demand model, which was what was the why associated with consuming any fruits, vegetables and nuts. And what we found globally, consistent, and when I say consistent, all of these why things are evident across markets. You know, people are people. The importance of these differed across markets, and we'll get to that in a minute. But these were the 6 key needs that people have whenever they buy fruits, vegetables or nuts, and that's taste, that's around refreshment, enjoyment, quick and easy, convenience, simplicity, health and nutrition, guilt-free, nourishing and sensible, indulgence, that comfort, relaxation, physical and mental energy, and connection, that's about bonding and celebration. So these are evident across the world and across those commodities, and they're a useful framework that enables us to be more targeted in terms of where we're showing up and why we're showing up and what needs we're actually delivering to consumers in different markets. And so in priority markets, these are the averages across the priorities. So taste, quick and easy, the top ones, and then the next one is health and nutrition. So once again, high-level summary slide there. But on the very next slide, this is where the detail comes out. And you can see where there's some differences across the markets. UAE particularly, very different profile. So hopefully when you start to go into these markets, you can use this data helpfully. And the Australian comparison is here too. So quick and easy is the #1 thing for Australia, but that didn't come across in really any other market, excepting Malaysia actually, but only slightly. But you can see that taste much more important in more other markets, and much more balanced some of the other markets, whereas Australia was a little bit more volatile in terms of more clear in terms of the thing that drove consumption. And then which were important when choosing to consume. So this was the breakdown of the details. So those 6 buckets, they're obviously built, they were factored by more detailed needs, and these are they. And you can see they're quick and easy in Australia, #2 coming up. But things like refreshing is really high just on its own. Really tasty is pretty high. To stop me feeling hungry in some of the markets. So there's lots of detail here for those of you who really want to get sink your teeth into some data. And these charts exist for every market in the appendix, so you'll find that there too. And the more functional things, fresh and light, refreshing taste and sweet, the key things that come up functionally. And there's more detail there. And you can once again see how those profiles differ, particularly in Indonesia. Crunchy is not very important in Indonesia, but in Malaysia it's the 2nd most important thing, or the 3rd most important thing, and very important to a 1/3 of people. So once again, very different needs. And this hopefully will help you decide what types of apples you might be more suitable for, types of varietals for each of these markets. And you may know a lot of this already. The next one is about the premium opportunity. So when we average the key priority markets, fresher was a key thing for almost half of consumers. Organic or free from pesticides, very important. Sweeter and safe and trusted was the next one. Oops, sorry, I'll go back again. And once again, you can see the different profiles of the different markets. And interesting again, the average there, fresher is really high for across all markets. But when it comes to safety, UAE, very important, food safety. And then higher in vitamins and minerals, much more important in places like Vietnam and Indonesia. So it starts to delve into, if you want to sell premium products in these markets, what are the types of things that you need to dial up in consumers' minds to convince them to pay more for your product? And then there's the barriers to consumption. So price, alternatives, and bruising easily. Although price is number one here, for an apple, 18% is very, very low. So for some of the other commodities, price was number one, but by a long way. So I dare say price is not a huge barrier here, but people always tick it because they always want something cheaper. So I would say that it would be useful to look at some other commodities and where they landed, particularly when you look at things like avocados and mangoes, much more expensive in terms of what their barriers are. So bear that in mind, and maybe that will be a useful comparison when you're thinking about this and when you're looking at some of this data. Alternatives is an interesting one, and we've got those below. Not surprisingly, bananas, mangoes are there, and pear also. But more bananas, mangoes for apples. Pear number 3, but you may have known that already. And bruising is the other one there that comes up as a barrier to overcome. And there's the detail for you there. And again, the detail on the different alternatives, and papaya comes up there. So we tried to throw in as many of the local fruits as we could, just so that there was a much, well, we couldn't throw in everything into the main part of the survey. So this was a question where we were able to capture many of those alternatives that consumers would yearn for in some of those other markets. The papaya is one that pops out here more significantly, and guava in Vietnam. And finally, for the very, very high level summary, here's a chart or a recommendation really with no data. And this was taking everything we know and everything we worked out about apples, putting it on one slide. And this is the where to play, how to win. So number one, the where to play is to focus on the strategic priority markets, where consumers are willing to pay a premium for quality apples. That seemed to be the dimension that really drove that. And Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, UAE, and we spent some time on that page, so you can see how that really is a big driver of that strategic priority. And we could leverage already high appeal for Australian apples across all priority markets. So there was already high appeal across those 4 markets, so a good starting point to go after those. And this can drive incremental growth for Australian apple exports. And in terms of the how to win, we obviously need to deliver the core, and that's around refreshing, tasty and sweet. And we need to ensure our apples are above par for being things like high in nutritional value, fresh and light, and that serve as a popular, quick and easy, any time of day choice. So the day part was variant across many of the strategic priorities. So it was just one of those things that is an any time of day type product, unlike many of the other commodities. Number 3 is leveraging the premium advantage. So this is about maximising the premium opportunity by delivering apples that are fresher, free of pesticides, sweeter, and come from a safe and trusted source, because that's how you convince people to pay more for an apple in those markets. And then finally, reducing consumption barriers. So too expensive came up, but once again, relative to other commodities, probably not a huge barrier. Less exciting than alternatives, so that came up quite a lot from others. And bruising is a key thing, that functional point that just makes it harder to pick it up. And also minimising, that would minimise consumer drift to the close substitutes. And in this case, it's bananas, mangoes and pears. And we'll get to pears in a minute. But really that's kind of, and I kind of got through that as recognising that we haven't got that much time, but hopefully that covered the key points for you and gives you a point of view of what this data is telling us. So I might pause there a minute now and take any questions or comments before we then go on to the pear section.
Thanks, Pat. Hands up or cameras and microphones on if there's any questions while we're still on apples. Looks like, Pat, you've answered people's curiosity around the apples. Perhaps we could just keep moving forward.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So pears, and we've talked about this, what goes into here, but for pears, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia came up trumps. And there's far more low-hanging fruit here, which is also promising, and I think many of you are, that there's much trade with some of these markets anyway. So you've got Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, and in this case, Japan actually creeps in. It's a little bit more addressable compared to apples. But nonetheless, when it comes to attractiveness, and I think I'm happy to share some of that data if you're interested for Japan. But if I recall, there'll be similar things going on there, which is the penetration, willingness to premium, etc., willingness to go for Australian, etc. So UK, once again, we saw this a lot with things like Pear's, local competition, distance, tariffs, and just their price. Willingness to pay price is very, very low in the UK. USA, high there. India, very attractive. UAE ends up being more of a longer term play here, less addressable for reasons that I'm happy to go into. But if you're satisfied that unless there's any questions about the positioning of the markets, we'll look at some of the detail in a minute. So yeah, we don't have to look at why these are there if you don't want to, but I'm happy to share that data with you. It's just time consuming, and I'm conscious that we've only got about half an hour left or a bit more. So let me know, Mila or others, if you'd like me to carry on, or if there's any questions or comments at this point.
I think we'll keep moving, Pat, unless a question comes up or a hand goes up. Again, the detail that Pat went through for apples does exist for pears as well. It's in the appendices of the reports. And you've just had a bit of guidance on how to read that. But look, if there are questions, please put your hand up and we'll pause. But I think we're good to keep going, Pat.
I'll carry on then. Let's do it. Okay. So these three markets chosen for high penetration and then their strong claim willingness to pay across the board, all three of these markets, that's really what drove their attractiveness. And then the addressability was driven by their moderate Australian appeal for Malaysia, but Vietnam and Indonesia had high Australian appeal, so they would have been at the very left of that chart that we were seeing before. Malaysia is slightly less likely to command a premium compared to some of the others, but the Vietnam had the greatest likelihood to command a premium, so that really put that very high. And Indonesia, moderate likelihood to command a premium. So it was around penetration, willingness to pay premium, and that openness to Australia, as I said, and the detail you can find if you want to have a look at it. So let's carry on and look at some more of the detail of those three markets. So there's the snapshot, there's the penetration, 35, 39, 43, snack between lunch and dinner, lunch and dessert, also for Pear in Vietnam, and snack and lunch in Indonesia. Fresh on its own, once again, big here. Taste and quick and easy came up very strongly. More connection in Vietnam for Pears, and health and nutritious in Indonesia. So in terms of the why, that core why, different across markets in terms of what's a priority, but taste number one for all. At home and with family, once again, with who are the key ones. So the differences on this page from the previous, so this was that strategic priorities. We've duplicated some here so that you can have it on one page. Functional attributes pop up here. Sweet, fresh and light. And refreshing taste are the three that cover across all markets. And the premium opportunity, fresher, is the number one thing. Sweeter creeps in Indonesia, and more appetizing in Vietnam would also be helpful. Malaysia, too expensive. We'll have a look in a minute how that pops. Bruising, a thing in Vietnam. And in Indonesia, more exciting alternatives, and too expensive or key barriers. And apples and bananas, not surprisingly, the substitutes that came up across the board. So now when we look at the when, once again, this has got the Australian data on it, and half of Australians say that they eat pears as a snack. Similar to Malaysia, very high, but Vietnam is very low in terms of as a snack. So you can see that much more spread. Lunch, dinner and dessert in Vietnam are really key day parts that come up. So once again, more interesting in terms of how you might go to market and what the different consumers favour. And as I mentioned before, if you go to then the Vietnamese market report, there's lots more detail about the dynamics of that consumer, what drives their attitudes to food and how they purchase and all sorts of things. So Once you decide that these are the markets to focus on, there's lots more in the market report that go into very specifics. But you can kind of see here, this gives you a snapshot of the differences across the markets. And then we break out snacking here. That's looking pretty similar across the board. Once again, Vietnam coming out slightly differently there. Snacking between breakfast and lunch showing is high compared to other geographies. How consumed, also very similar when you compare it to Australia. Malaysia, far more fresh on its own, and Indonesia, far more difference, I would say. So that's an interesting dynamic going on. These look very uniform in home and across the board. So once again, useful data. We had to report on it. So if you want it, it's there. Where did you get it from? I'll take that bark as a bark of support, hopefully. Feeling like a pear. So purchased it myself. Yeah, it's a bit about the shopping behaviour. Where did you get it from? So I missed a slide there. And who were you with? And once again, yeah, this dynamic around the family and sharing coming across in these markets very strongly. So we saw that in many commodities. So yeah, just a lot more sharing of meals is what this suggests. 51% in Australia just by myself, but that's higher than any of the others. When you look at with spouse partner, there's a lot more shared experiences here in those other markets. So that's an interesting dynamic. Here is the why, and you've seen that. So the why for a pear is taste is 2/3 of people want taste as the core. Half want quick and easy, and then health and nutrition is another key one. 41% would say that health and nutrition is why they have a pear. And then here's the detail, and Australian comparable data is on there as well. So in Australia, quick and easy is very high, but it's taste that comes up number one across the board. And in Vietnam, connection. So these charts are interesting to look at what the differences are across those markets. And as I said, gives you a snapshot, and then hopefully gives you cause to then go to the Vietnamese market report where you'll find much more detail. But this does give you a bit of a side-by-side snapshot of what the differences are. And then there's the detail around the, so we pull apart those dimensions. So if you want to dig into that, like what does that really mean? Good for sharing. So that's where that connection. So connection is built from a number of these factors, but that's one of them. And 30% of Vietnamese consumers say that a pear is good for sharing. So that's a much higher than any other market. And I think that's the case for other markets as well. Okay, and then more functionally, sweetness is big for 1/3 of people, and refreshing taste, fresh and light. So all pretty important functionally, those three. And then here's the detail. Fresh and light, most important in Indonesia. And with a light, mild taste is different in Vietnam. So yeah, when I look at these profiles, it's Vietnam that comes across as different, and one that you might need to separate as a unique one when you start looking at how to go to market there. When it comes to the premium opportunity for pears, half would say fresher is the number one. Another 1/3 would say sweeter. More appetizing, not bruised is how to read that, 30%. And then 28% would say in the right state of ripeness. Always a challenge for these fruits, but important when it comes to premium. And then that's the detail there, so you can see the relativities. And Vietnam, once again, showing the difference. More appetizing, not bruised or damaged. It's really Vietnam that's driving that that metric there. You can see 46% pop along that factor. And then when it comes to barriers, it's bruising that's number one, 24%. Price, 23%, and exciting alternatives, 22%. So all a bit higher than apples here. And then you can see those leading substitutes, 53 apples, 45 bananas, and then mangoes also creeping in there, 39%, less than the other two. And then that's how they look across the markets. So when it comes to expense, it's Malaysia and Indonesia that are saying that it's too expensive, not in Vietnam. It's the bruising that's a big deal in Vietnam. So that feels like something to investigate regarding how products show up. and how the market dynamics are there with the route to market. So you can see some of this data might precipitate investigating other things and what's going on, but that's a significant 38% of Vietnamese consumers saying it bruises easily, and they don't want that in their pears. And also just a very different dynamic to some of the other markets here. And then what else would you typically consider? We saw apples and bananas come across. So the dimensions very similar here, and very similar to very similar to each other. But in Vietnam, table grapes comes up as very high too, number 3 in fact, and papayas big in Indonesia, so quite unique to there. But those other commodities still very high too. So and papayas big in Malaysia actually as well. So gives you an indication of what other fruits are really digging into and our competition in some of these markets. And then finally, the focus of, and this is the recommendation, so it's focusing on markets where penetration is high. So we saw penetration being a key driver here. Also that willingness to pay a premium, and Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam are those markets. We should leverage already high appeal for Australia. That should say pears. In Indonesia, Vietnam, and improve appeal in Malaysia to drive incremental growth in Australian pears. In terms of the core, it's refreshing taste, health and nutrition, and convenience indulgence, which is important here. Sweet, fresh and light, good source of vitamins and minerals, and a healthy lunch or snack came through. But we saw that there were many day parts, particularly when you dig into some of those markets that differentiate themselves. We saw that if for the leveraging the premium advantage for a pear, fresher, sweeter and organic and in the right state of ripeness is important for people to want to pay more for a pear. Bruising, expense and that less exciting alternative were key ones there. And apples, bananas, mangoes are our key competitors there. Papayas also when you look at specific markets. But these slides are about that overall strategic point of view. So once again, no data here, and that just gives you a bit of a snapshot as to what to do. So once again, I'll pause there for any questions or comments, or if you want me to go back and show you any slides or some data that you found interesting along the way. So I'll hand over to the floor at the moment.
Thanks, Pat. That's wonderful. It's very interesting to see the differences between apple and pears, and where they have a difference, where to play and a different how to win. Any questions, comments? Anyone find something surprising or would like Pat to delve into either the apple or pear information? This is your time. How can we support your understanding of this work? And if you can't find the raise hand button, simply turn your microphone on and speak up. Well, I think we must have spellbound them all, Pat.
I'm conscious there's lots of data, so but if there's any observations about, and as you say, Mila, surprises or things that you found unusual. We had a good chat about Japan for apples. I don't know if there's a view from those involved in pears whether these, because I mean this was the nub of the work really, is to working out where we should go and where we're going to get our best return on investment. We really sweated this, so if this is looking right, that's very reassuring. But we'd be happy to discuss that even further and give any guidance on why these ended up where they did end up.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Any comments or questions on that? And for those that haven't yet looked at the full reports, Jade just put the link in the chat of how you can register to access all of the reports. And I think that might answer your question, whoever's just popped that question in the chat. Hello, how are you? Ask your question.
My name's Tom. I just had a question. We seem to be seeing a lot of words popping up in this pear one, fresh and light. Like they're not traditionally words that are associated with pears. Like they're generally not fresh and light. So are they wanting us to find them a fresh and light pear, do you suggest?
Thanks, that's a great question. Pat, perhaps you can describe what does fresh and light actually mean? Pat, sorry, you're on mute. You've put yourself on mute.
Oh, I put myself on mute. Okay, let's tackle that directly, shall we? Because I think that's a very good question. So first of all, the why. So this question was, and what the way to read this is the questions up on the top in the middle there are exactly what we asked respondents. So which were important when choosing to consume, and in this case it was a pear. So this is the core why. So we've got really tasty, refreshing, but your question was around fresh and light, and that came in more into the functional one, which was next. So let's dig into that here. So what were you looking for when you consumed? You can see respondents were asked to tick any one that applied here. So the way to read this is the relativities of each one. So generally, and Olivia, remind me whether we put a cap on this, but often we say, you know, pick 3 to 5 that apply, or up to 3 or something like that. So in this case, what were you looking for when you consumed your pear? So we ask about a pear occasion. And then this is saying that sweet is number 1, really refreshing, fresh and light. So look, in Malaysia, not Vietnam and Indonesia, fresh and light was something that was coming up. So the perception in those markets is that they were looking for a fresh and light pear, and that was really what drove their consumption of it. So I don't know. I mean, that doesn't surprise me, but if it surprises you, then we can have a further chat about it, because I certainly like a fresh and light pear. But I think what you might be alluding to is that sometimes it either may not be fresh, i.e. it may be soft or not, and it might not be that light, as in it might be hard. But what this is telling us is that to optimize the core of what people are looking for, delivering a pear that is fresh and light gives you a better chance of someone picking up a pear. And certainly in Malaysia and Indonesia, particularly Indonesia, that's what's really driving that. I hope that makes sense.
I was just going to add that actually from the Australian results, this is Jane here. I'm the
Hi, Jane, how are you?
GM of marketing.
Mm-hmm.
That we do see that consumers in Australia also are thinking of it as fresh and light. So yeah. I think it actually does deliver on that for some.
Mm-hmm. What's
Thanks,
also
Jane.
interesting here that I see, look at this, Vietnam, they over-index in what they say is with a light, mild taste. That's something that they look for. And that's almost the counterpoint. And remembering these were translated, so I note that in fresh and light, only 16% of people ticked it, but with light and mild taste, 26%. So if you added those two together, it starts to look very similar for that market as well. So really, light and fresh does seem to be something that people desire in a pear in these markets. And from what you're saying, Jane, because I don't have the data in front of me, is that that's also consistent with Australia. So that's useful to know.
Thank you for that question, observation, and the commentary. That's really useful. Is there any other comments or questions or observations? You can hear from the way Pat's presenting this data, there is a depth of and a richness of information here, and you've got the subject matter expert in front of you, and he can certainly help you work out how to read this information, but also where to deep dive, because for each of the other markets in the study, you can see this sort of information if you so wish. I'm not seeing any hands up. Did I miss something in the chat? Thanks, Olivia, for confirming respondents were asked to select 3 to 5 responses. What were you looking for at that time when you were consuming your fruit? So
thanks, Olivia.
That's great.
I just flicked to this side. This was about premium, and fresher comes up really high. So yeah, people really want fresh, and that means that if you can deliver the freshest pear you've got, you're much more likely to get a premium price for it in these markets. That's how to read this.
That's terrific. So we could also take comments or questions from the Hort Innovation staff who are here. I know for some of you, you haven't had a deep dive into this data a lot of times, but you do work one-on-one or in lots of small groups with the industry folks who are here. So if there's something you have that you'd like clarified, to make sure that if you take away any questions from today, that's also great. You're more than welcome to put your hand up and jump in. Well, Pat, it looks like you have satisfied all questions, and we've done a great job. I probably would just quickly remind folks that Jade has put the link in the chat. You would register for access to this reports, and we do want people to keep the reports internally to Australia for Australian horticulture. You can access the full category reports for fruits, vegetables and nuts, so you can have a look at whether you can have a look at how apple, pears compares with others. Jenny asked the question earlier of how does it the situation for Japan compare with citrus and table grapes. You yourself can look up all of that information if you so desire. Pat gave us a couple of caveats at the beginning when we're thinking about this sort of work and the results that this study has generated, and they probably value repeating here. The approach that we asked them to take, that Kantar took in this study, is agnostic to technical market access. So it's about identifying future growth geographies. Markets with this existing trade, it may not actually reflect where you're currently trading. So it's an objective analysis about existing markets. Also, that premium opportunities are intentionally highlighted, so they deliberately targeted where would we see a price premium for Australia, and that's where we have a stronger right to play. And again, that this is just one input data into decision making about where you do focus your export interests. If the information you've heard today makes you want to rethink, makes you want to have a deep dive, we've given you the link. If you've got any questions or you get stuck anywhere, please reach out to anyone at Hort Innovation. Jade Curley, who's on the screen with us here, is our project manager. She can help you find the information. But unless there's further questions or hands up, and I can't see any, I'd just like to thank Pat Fry again for his presentation today. Patrick, without you doing this, there's no way we could deep dive into this, really a wealth of information there. It's very, very interesting. There's some great comments around how this is useful new evidence to understand where we might go and chase those future geographies. Lots of information to read. So thank you very much, Pat.
Pleasure.
And we have recorded this. We'll wrap that up. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is a survey at the end. We do welcome your feedback. We do really value feedback. We hope to be able to improve as we move forward. So thank you again, Pat. Thank you, everyone. If there's any questions, please reach out to Jade or myself. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.